A while back, I found myself replaying the same conversation in my head over and over again. You know the kind. The kind where you imagine the perfect comeback hours too late. I had just left a meeting with someone who, if I'm being honest, was a professional button pusher. Every word, every glance felt like it was designed to get under my skin, and it worked. I got home that night, sat at my kitchen table, and I was still carrying the weight of that conversation. My family was talking, dinner was on the stove, but my mind was still locked in that room, stuck in an argument that was already over. And the hard truth hit me. I had handed over my peace, and I didn't even notice it happening. Here's what I know. Difficult people exist everywhere. They sit across from us at the dinner table, walk past us in the office, and sometimes they share our last name. And while we can't control how they act, we do get to decide how much power we give them. And I want to be clear about something. Protecting your peace isn't about avoiding hard people or pretending their behavior doesn't hurt. It's about learning how to stay grounded when others are doing their best to pull you off center. It's about keeping hold of your power, especially when someone else is trying to take it. So how do you do that? How do you handle difficult people without losing yourself? There are 5 things that make all the difference. First, clarity is your best friend. I'll be honest, when it comes to handling difficult people, clarity isn't always the first thing we think about. What we really want is for them to change. We want them to wake up one morning, realize how exhausting they've been, and magically become easier to deal with. But here's the truth. You can't control how other people show up, but you can get really clear on how you do. And clarity, it's a game changer. I remember a conversation I had with someone I care about deeply. Every time we talked, I walked away feeling drained, like I was somehow responsible for fixing their problems, smoothing things over, and making everything okay. And for the longest time, I thought the answer was to just be nicer, to give more, to stretch myself thinner, to accommodate whatever they needed. But the more I did, the more resentful I became. And let's be clear, resentment isn't a sign that you're too nice. It's a sign that you're unclear. One day, after another heavy, one-sided conversation, I realized something. I was waiting for them to respect boundaries I had never actually set. I assumed they should just know what was too much. But here's the thing, people aren't mind readers. And when we expect others to honor limits we've never spoken out loud, we set ourselves up for disappointment. Every time. So I did something uncomfortable. I got clear. I decided what I was willing to give, what I wasn't, and where the line was. And when that next conversation rolled around, I said the words that felt impossible. I love you, but I can't carry this for you. Let me tell you, that clarity, it changed everything. Not because the other person magically became easier, but because I became grounded. I knew where I stood, and that gave me the freedom to engage with compassion without losing myself in the process. And here's what I've learned. When you aren't clear about your limits, you will resent the people who cross them. But when you are clear, you give yourself a fighting chance to stay connected without getting consumed. Research backs this up. Studies show that people who set clear, consistent boundaries experience less emotional exhaustion and stronger relationships. Why? Because clarity reduces confusion. It eliminates the guesswork and makes it easier for both sides to navigate the relationship. And I know boundaries get a bad reputation. People think they're harsh or selfish, but boundaries aren't walls. They're edges. They define where you end and someone else begins. And without them, you lose sight of who you are. I've seen this play out in so many conversations when people come to me and say, I'm exhausted by this person. I feel like I'm constantly being pulled in a million directions. My first question is always the same. Where are you unclear? Because most of the time, it's not just that the other person is difficult. It's that we haven't taken the time to name, even to ourselves, what we will and won't allow. And let's be honest, clarity isn't easy. It requires you to sit with the discomfort of asking yourself hard questions. What am I responsible for and what am I not? Where am I overextending myself to avoid conflict? What do I need to say that I've been too afraid to voice? These questions aren't soft. They require courage because when you get clear, you might disappoint people who are used to you being endlessly available. You might risk a little awkwardness. But here's what's also true. Clarity is kindness. not just to the other person, but to yourself. And if you're wondering, where do I start? Start small. Clarity doesn't mean announcing sweeping boundaries overnight. It can be as simple as saying, I'm not available for that, or I'm happy to help, but I can't take on the whole thing. It's these small, clear moments that protect your peace without hardening your heart. Because at the end of the day, you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to allow. And when you're clear about who you are and what you stand for, no one gets to decide your peace for you. And that's power. Second, you cannot heal what you won't name. I was talking with someone recently who said, I don't know why this person bothers me so much, but every time I'm around them, I leave feeling completely drained. And I get it. We've all had that experience. The one person who can walk into a room and within 5 minutes shift your entire mood. Sometimes it's obvious why they get under our skin, but other times it's murky. And when we can't name what's really happening, we stay stuck in a loop of frustration. Here's the truth. If you don't name what's hurting you, it will quietly run your life. I remember working with someone years ago who was consistently difficult. They were critical, dismissive, and had a way of making me feel small without ever raising their voice. And no matter how much I tried to brush it off, I couldn't shake the irritation I felt every time I interacted with them. At first, I told myself the usual things. It's not a big deal. I shouldn't take it personally. I'm probably overreacting. But that didn't stop the pit in my stomach every time their name popped up on my phone. One day, after a particularly tough exchange, I sat down and asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. What is this really about? And when I got honest, the answer was simple. I felt unseen. Every time they dismissed my input or brushed off my ideas, it touched something deeper. The fear that no matter how hard I worked, I still wasn't enough. And here's the thing, until I named that truth, I couldn't do anything about it. Because when we stay at the surface, just reacting to how people make us feel, we miss the deeper work. But when we get curious and name what's really going on, we take our power back. Research shows that when we accurately name our emotions, whether it's anger, shame, or disappointment, it lowers the emotional intensity. Neuroscientists call this name it to tame it. When you give your feelings language, you engage the rational part of your brain and calm the emotional storm. It's like shining a light in a dark room. Suddenly, what felt overwhelming becomes manageable. But here's the tricky part. Naming what's underneath requires courage. Because sometimes the thing we have to name isn't just about the other person. It's about us. Maybe their behavior reminds you of an old wound you thought you'd healed. Maybe their criticism triggers your fear of being judged. Maybe their constant neediness reflects a pattern where you feel responsible for everyone else's happiness. Whatever it is, you can't heal it if you won't face it. And I know when someone is difficult, the last thing we want to do is turn inward. It feels easier to point the finger and say, if they would just change, I'd be fine. But here's what I've learned the hard way. You can't outsource your peace to someone else's behavior. If your emotional well-being depends on whether other people are kind, thoughtful, or self-aware, you'll always be at their mercy. So here's where the work begins. When someone triggers you, don't just react. Get curious. Ask yourself, what am I feeling beneath the frustration? What story am I telling myself about their behavior? What part of me is this touching that still needs healing? And when you name it, you shift the dynamic. Suddenly, the power isn't in their hands anymore, it's in yours. You stop waiting for them to change and start changing how much access they have to your peace. Because here's what I know. You don't have to let someone else's behavior decide your worth. When you name the truth, you reclaim your ability to respond with clarity instead of reacting from pain. And that's how you stay grounded when everything around you feels messy. Third, resentment is a red flag. I used to think resentment was just a sign that someone had crossed a line, that if I was feeling resentful, it meant the other person was doing something wrong, being too demanding, too critical, or just too much. But the more I paid attention, the more I realized something uncomfortable. Resentment usually isn't just about what someone else is doing, it's about what I'm not saying. I learned this lesson the hard way. There was a season in my life where I found myself feeling resentful all the time, at work, at home, everywhere. I was constantly thinking, why am I the one holding everything together? I felt overextended, underappreciated, and exhausted. And instead of addressing it, I did what a lot of us do. I pushed through. I told myself I was being a team player. I told myself it wasn't worth the fight. I told myself that eventually people would notice how much I was doing and offer to lighten the load. Spoiler alert, they didn't. And here's what I realized. Resentment is not just a feeling, it's a signal. It's our body's way of telling us, hey, something's out of alignment. And more often than not, it means one of two things. We're either overgiving or under-communicating. When I finally got honest with myself, I could see it clearly. I was saying yes when I wanted to say no. I was agreeing to things out of obligation instead of authenticity. And every time I swallowed my feelings to keep the peace, I was choosing temporary comfort over long-term clarity. And let's be real, that never ends well. The research backs this up. Studies show that people who suppress their needs to avoid conflict experience higher levels of burnout and resentment over time. And that resentment, it doesn't just sit quietly in the background, it leaks out in sarcasm, in passive-aggressive comments, in withdrawing from the people we care about. We tell ourselves we're holding it together, but our frustration is doing all the talking. And here's the thing. You can't build healthy relationships on unspoken expectations. If you don't tell people what you need, you set them up to disappoint you. And it's not fair to be angry with someone for crossing a boundary you never clearly set. I know these conversations can feel awkward. Saying, I can't take on more right now, or I'm feeling overwhelmed and need support, doesn't roll off the tongue for most of us. But here's the truth. Unspoken resentment doesn't protect relationships. It corrodes them. And clarity, no matter how uncomfortable in the moment, is what keeps us connected in the long run. I had to learn how to ask myself some hard questions. Am I being clear about what I need? Am I saying yes to things that are costing me my peace? Am I waiting for people to read my mind instead of using my voice? And when I started answering those questions honestly, the resentment started to lift, not because everyone else changed, but because I changed how I showed up. I stopped saying yes when I meant no. I stopped expecting people to guess my limits, and I learned that saying no to things that drain you is actually saying yes to the things that sustain you. Here's the bottom line. You are allowed to ask for what you need. You are allowed to have limits. And you are allowed to protect your peace, even if it disappoints people who are used to you doing it all. Because resentment isn't just a feeling you carry, it's a sign that something needs your attention. And the sooner you listen, the sooner you get your peace back. Fourth, compassion doesn't mean being a doormat. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us got the message that being a good person means being endlessly patient, always available, and willing to tolerate behavior that hurts us. And if we push back even a little, we start to worry that we're being harsh, unkind, or selfish. But here's what I know for sure. Compassion without boundaries is not compassion, it's self-betrayal. I remember a conversation I had with someone who had a habit of unloading every problem they had onto me. And I'm not talking about the normal, healthy sharing we all need from time to time. I'm talking about the kind of emotional dumping that left me feeling completely depleted. And every time it happened, I told myself, be kind, be patient. They're going through a lot, but here's the hard truth. You can care deeply about someone and still not be responsible for carrying their emotional load. And this isn't just personal experience, there's research to back it up. Studies show that empathy fatigue is a very real thing. When we consistently overextend ourselves emotionally without clear limits, we're not just more exhausted, we're also less effective at showing genuine compassion over time. In other words, when we're stretched too thin, we lose the ability to show up as the best version of ourselves. It's easy to confuse being compassionate with being endlessly available. But there's a big difference between being kind and being responsible for someone else's emotional well-being. True compassion doesn't mean letting people drain you. It means showing up with an open heart while honoring your own limits. I had to learn how to say something that felt impossible at first. I care about you, but I can't be your only support system. And it wasn't easy. There was a part of me that worried I'd sound cold or uncaring. But here's what actually happened. When I got clear about my limits, I was able to engage with more presence and kindness because I wasn't carrying what wasn't mine to hold. And here's the thing, when we don't set boundaries, resentment and exhaustion creep in. And you cannot be deeply kind to others when you're running on empty. When I talk with people who feel overwhelmed by the demands of difficult relationships, my first question is almost always, where are you giving beyond your capacity? Because compassion doesn't mean giving until you have nothing left. You can love people and still say no. You can care deeply and still protect your peace. I get it. There's a real fear that setting boundaries will damage relationships. But here's the truth that's hard to swallow. Any relationship that falls apart because you set a healthy boundary was built on an unhealthy foundation to begin with. The people who genuinely care about you will respect your limits. And the ones who don't, they were never truly honoring you in the first place. I'm not saying it's easy. It takes courage to speak up and say, this is what I can offer, and this is where I draw the line. But the most compassionate thing you can do for yourself and for others is to be clear about what you're willing to give. When you show up with clarity, you model self-respect. And when you model self-respect, you give others permission to do the same. At the end of the day, real compassion is about balance. It's about holding space for others without losing yourself in the process. And when you start honoring your own limits, something powerful happens. You stop confusing self-sacrifice with love, and you start showing up from a place of genuine care, not obligation. And that's the kind of compassion that lasts. Fifth, you decide who gets a seat at your table. One of the most powerful things I've learned is this: not everyone deserves full access to you. And I don't mean that in a harsh, dismissive way. I mean that in a deeply intentional, self-respecting way. Because the truth is, who we allow into our lives, who we let influence our thoughts, energy, and emotions, shapes everything. I once heard someone say, you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And whether that's scientifically precise or not, I think we can all feel the truth in it. The people closest to us impact how we see ourselves, how we handle challenges, and even how we show up in the world. So if you constantly feel drained, belittled, or emotionally manipulated by certain people in your life, it's worth asking, why do they have this much access to me? And I get it. Sometimes we don't feel like we have a choice. Maybe the difficult person is a family member, a coworker, or someone we've known forever. And we tell ourselves things like, I can't just cut them off, or I don't want to be rude. But here's the thing. Setting limits isn't about cutting people out. It's about choosing how much influence they have. Picture this. Imagine your life as a dinner table. The people in your inner circle, the ones you trust, who uplift you, who show up with love and honesty, they get a seat right next to you. They get the full experience of who you are. But the people who are consistently disrespectful, negative, or harmful, maybe they don't get to sit at the head of the table. Maybe they get a seat farther away. Maybe they don't get an invitation at all. This isn't about being cruel or unforgiving. It's about recognizing that your energy, your peace, and your emotional well-being are worth protecting. And sometimes that means deciding that someone can still be in your life, but with boundaries that allow you to engage on your terms. I had to learn this firsthand. There was someone in my life who always had a way of making me feel small. Every conversation was a battle. Subtle jabs, backhanded compliments, a constant undercurrent of negativity. And for years, I told myself that's just how they are. I made excuses, I minimized the impact, and I convinced myself that if I could just be more patient, more understanding, it wouldn't bother me as much. But the truth was, it did bother me. It chipped away at my confidence, it made me second guess myself, it made me feel exhausted every time I was around them. And finally, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding: if someone else treated me this way, would I tolerate it? The answer was obvious. So I made a choice. I didn't have a dramatic falling out. I didn't make a grand announcement. I simply stopped giving them full access to me. I stopped sharing vulnerable parts of myself with someone who had shown me over and over that they wouldn't handle them with care. And let me tell you, that decision gave me back so much peace. The research is clear. Our emotional well-being is deeply tied to the quality of our relationships. Studies show that people with strong, supportive social connections are not only happier, but also healthier and more resilient in the face of stress. But that only works when the relationships are mutually respectful and nourishing. So here's the invitation. Take inventory. Who in your life makes you feel seen, valued, and safe? And who consistently drains, diminishes, or disrespects you? And most importantly, who are you giving front row access to, even though they haven't earned it? Because at the end of the day, you are allowed to be intentional about who you let close. You are allowed to choose relationships that lift you up, not weigh you down. And when you do, you reclaim your peace, your energy, and your power. And that changes everything. At the heart of it all, handling difficult people isn't about changing them, it's about reclaiming yourself. It's about recognizing your worth, setting boundaries that honor your peace, and deciding who gets the privilege of your presence. When you step into that power, you stop living at the mercy of other people's behavior and start building a life rooted in clarity, self-respect, and freedom. So as you move forward, remember this: you are not powerless. You have a say. You get to choose how much access people have, and you are allowed to protect your peace without apology. It's not easy work, but it's some of the most important work you will ever do. Good luck. You've got this.